Great. So we were talking last class about how Locke thinks political power uses the law to regulate property. How is the government going to use political power in this fashion? Well, now Locke is going to subdivide political power into various kinds of powers. The main distinction that Locke wants to draw is between legislative and executive power. It's very important here to not think too much of the American idea of separation of powers. That's not exactly what Locke is talking about, because his idea is these powers aren't cleanly separated. These powers aren't cleanly separated. So, for example, in Locke's time, the legislative power, Parliament, could sometimes act as a court. So, for example, in the English Civil Wars, these happened in the middle of the 17th century, when basically Parliament accused King Charles II of treason. They tried him for treason. They found him guilty of treason, and they, in fact, executed the guy. It was the first regicide in modern European history. But you can see here that the legislative can sometimes act as judiciary. So there isn't a super clean separation of powers in Locke. That idea, separation of powers, actually comes the next century, from the 18th century, from a guy named Montesquieu, and that's where U.S. founders picked the idea up. So I just want to make that caveat. At the same time, when we're actually just thinking through Locke for purposes of convenience of presentation, I'm going to talk as if the powers are cleanly separated, because the examples are just a lot cleaner. Okay, so historically, it's not what I'm doing is not really justified, but in terms of getting the philosophy down and just getting the simple principles down, I've got to simplify it quite a bit. Okay, main distinction is legislative versus executive power. The reason why this is the main distinction is Locke wants to say that legislative power is more important than executive power. In order to make that claim of importance, to claim that the legislative is supreme, Locke is going to have to distinguish those powers to some degree. Legislative power is the supreme power for two reasons. The first is Locke thinks that you have to write laws before you can execute laws. It's almost as simple as that. So if there weren't a legislative set up, Locke would say, this whole idea that the government will use law to regulate property couldn't get off the ground. Because remember, one of the defining features of a civil society is the presence of government, and to get the government, project working, you've got to be able to pass laws. Okay, so that's one reason. And then the second reason, as we'll see, that Locke wants to separate legislative from executive power to some degree is he's very worried about executive power. He thinks executive power is dangerous. The legislative is tasked with passing civil laws. So civil society is regulated by civil laws. And because Locke believes in things like the rule of law, he believes that the laws rule and not individual persons rule. Okay, so civil laws are kind of the glue of a civil society. Civil laws are what are supposed to hold a civil society together. And it's the government's administration of the law that puts people into the equation, but the laws themselves are quite important. Civil laws have to have a couple characteristics in order to qualify as such. First of all, they've got to be settled, Locke says. So take the point of contrast. The point of contrast is the dictator says, Today, it's legal to kill enemies without trial. And then the next day he says, actually, it's no longer legal. And then the third day he says, I found some more enemies. It's time to kill enemies without trial again. Okay, that's not settled. That's one day you say X, and the next day you say the complete opposite of X. Okay, so civil laws, Locke doesn't put any time stamp on it. He doesn't say a civil law has to be in effect 10 years or else it's not settled. But you get the idea. The idea is laws are meant to be permanent. And this makes a certain sort of sense if you believe that what's holding your society together is law. Okay, so who knows how long they have to last, but certainly if it's changing from one day to the next, that's not good. Things are unstable. Secondly, civil laws have to be known somehow. So if you pass a law and you expect people to follow the law, the government has to have some means of publicizing the law, some way of getting knowledge that this is indeed what the law says to the citizenry, to the group of subjects, Locke would say, at large. Okay, and you can see some of the implications of this. If the law isn't known, how are you going to legitimately punish people for breaking the law? In that case, they would be able to legitimately plead ignorance. Hey, I didn't know that this particular drug was illegal, or this particular action was prohibited, whatever that action might be. Okay, so civil laws, there has to be a sort of general consciousness of what the law is. And of course, when more specialized knowledge of the law is necessary, say people get into some civil lawsuits and they need some legal experts who can go look in the law books, see what the law is so they can argue their clients' cases and so forth. Yes, the law will be available. And you can take this quite far if there's some kind of deliberations, say in the parliament or in your Congress or whatever your legislative is called, regarding what the law should be. Those deliberations should be open. It's got to be available to the public. There has to be publicity. There has to be some kind of publicity to the law, the law itself, as well as the process for making the law. Okay, so civil laws, settled and known, uniform. Uniform. Civil laws have got to be uniform. And what Locke is really emphasizing here is sameness. Sameness. So when it doesn't matter, social differences, personal differences, personal likes and dislikes, social discrimination, all that should not matter for the execution of the law. Laws that have discrimination baked into them, Locke would say, laws that too quickly and for no legitimate reason distinguish between people, say a law that is about basically ethnocide or genocide, that not only violates the law of nature, which is that humankind should be preserved, but it also basically makes the law not uniform. The law is uneven. The discrimination is just baked right into the law. So Locke could not justify a law like that for a variety of reasons. But also notice that in the case of let's say, an ethnically and racially discriminatory law, that one that aims at the elimination of the people, really, the real problem with that is that the civil law there does not preserve the spirit of natural law. And that's what Locke is really getting at. His idea is that civil laws are like a more refined and a more developed form of the natural law. So the civil law is nowhere going to write down, in the law books, say, well, and God wants the species he created to endure. Locke is not going to say that. In fact, Locke believed in the separation of church and state. Can't get into that right now, but he was one of the first proponents of something we now call religious toleration. So the civil law is not going to write that down. But Locke is going to say the spirit of that natural law has to be preserved in the civil law. And when the civil law seems to blatantly contradict the spirit of the natural law and legalize mass murder, for example, there's something wrong with that law. It's probably not a civil law. It's probably more like the arbitrary, discriminatory, secretly crafted whims of a dictator. Okay, so civil law somehow has to preserve the spirit of the natural law, even if it's not going to preserve the exact letter. Here's another way that the legislature is extremely important for Locke. Locke says the legislative power is unalterable. Unalterable. And by this, he basically means it's baked into the Constitution. Caveat here, and this is once again how Locke's situation is different than the United States. Caveat here is in England, they didn't have a written constitution. So really, when English people argued that, for example, that the parliament is the supreme power, parliament and not king is the supreme power, what they were really referring to was notions, of long-standing traditions. Long-standing traditions. So the idea, the gist is, don't mess with the long-standing constitutional arrangements. So Locke says, take a hypothetical. If you've got a kingdom and the king wields the preponderance of legislative power, you can't take the legislative power out of the king's hands and move it into a parliament-like body. That would be turning a monarchy into a democracy. And the same difference, if you're in a more or less democratic country and the legislative is being held by, the legislative power is being held by a parliament-like body, you cannot take that power out of the parliament-like body's hand and put it into the hands of a monarch. In that case, the monarch is taking what's not theirs. Okay, so it goes both ways. You basically cannot change the constitutional form. That's what Locke thinks. So the social contract is like, it's got to be permanent. That's Locke's idea. The social contract should be permanent. You can't go about changing the social contract from day to day. That leads straight to instability and constant upheaval, which Locke isn't against totally, but the idea is stability. You want a settled constitutional arrangement. That's Locke's idea. Okay. Main distinction is legislative versus executive power for another reason. The reason is that Locke believes the executive power is more dangerous than legislative power. Why would he think this? Well, an executive needs to be permanent. A legislature need not be always in session. So the laws are in constant need of enforcement. There's always got to be a body, a group of officers in the civil society, in the government, whose task is to make sure that the laws have some consequences behind them, to make sure that the laws have some punishments attached to them. Okay, and that's why the executive has always got to be, loosely speaking, in session. Executive can't really take a vacation. If somebody in the executive takes a vacation, you need somebody else to take the place. A legislature doesn't always have to be in session. The legislature should not just be passing laws willy-nilly every day, thousands and thousands of laws. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so you don't constantly have to be writing laws. The additional complication comes in the fact that in many European countries, especially when they still had kings around, and especially when these kings, in principle even, did not admit any limitations on their power. In this kind of situation, the king often had the right to convene, to call together the legislative. And so in countries like England, this meant that Parliament wouldn't be in session unless the king convened them. In France, the idea was prior to the French Revolution, there was something called the Estates General. The king had to call the members of the States General together. Okay, so you can imagine if there's a king with some designs on absolute power who wants to be an absolute monarch, you can see what they'd want to do. They could claim, well, come on, you don't need to be in session all the time, Parliament. We don't really need new laws right now. So I'm just not going to call Parliament. I'm just not going to call Parliament into session. Don't worry, Parliament. I got this handled. I can handle this. Okay, that's dangerous. Another reason the executive is dangerous is that it's typically entrusted with additional powers that aren't, strictly speaking, executive powers. So Locke says executives, and you can think about, for example, the presidency in the United States. You can think about the State Department in the United States. The executive has something Locke is going to call federative power. And federative power is basically the power that any government has to negotiate and have relations with other governments. So remember, these governments are in a state of nature with respect to each other because they don't have a common government ruling both of them. So if the King of France and the King of England make some deal, they're exercising their federative power. Okay, well, Locke doesn't really elaborate that, so I'm not going to elaborate it here because he doesn't think the main threats here are coming from foreign powers, apparently. He does think that there's a big threat to the subject's liberties with what he calls prerogative power. Prerogative power in our 21st century is often called emergency power. Emergency power. More technically put, some people call it the power to make exceptions. The power to make exceptions. So Locke said that prerogative power is when an executive, typically an executive, claims that they are doing public good without a rule. Without a rule. What does that mean? Usually, the job of the executive is to enforce rules. This is the primary job of the umpire state, the state that acts like an umpire. Hey, that's out of bounds, that's in bounds, you're safe, you're out. Okay, you're just basically applying rules. The executive is in the case of prerogative power, saying the rules don't apply right now. We are in some kind of dire or emergency situation where I cannot, if I'm tasked with providing for the common good, because remember, common good, protecting the property, that's the main point of political power. I'm going to have to bend the rules. I'm going to have to break the rules. I'm going to have to make an exception to the rule in order to protect the public at large. Okay, in the United States, a lot of these expressions of executive prerogative come in the form of executive orders. So, for example, we all know that, Abraham Lincoln, I don't know if we all know it, I think most of us know that during the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln claimed prerogative power. He issued something called Emancipation Proclamation, and he said, yes, I understand, constitutionally, slavery is legal, although there were arguments about that, but right now, that doesn't make sense, and all the enslaved people in the rebellious southern states are now freed. Okay, and it is also widely known that FDR also made similar claims to prerogative power in World War II, where he doubted the loyalty of Japanese Americans during this total war, this big world global conflict. And he basically said, for the public good, for the public safety, we are going to put Japanese Americans from the West Coast into concentration camps. Okay, so you can see here that prerogative power seems to go a variety of directions, some of them which may seem more defensible than others, but Locke's main point would be not this instance is good and this instance is bad, but he would say, look how dangerous this is. Look how dangerous this is. And who's going to say if prerogative power is being used correctly? Who's going to judge if prerogative power is being used for the public good? Because you can see here a problem arises. If you're going to start acting outside of the bounds of law, if you're the executive and you're no longer just saying, I'm going to interpret the law and apply the law, but rather you're saying, I'm not following the law right now, but I still claim to be exercising legitimate political power. In other words, using government power for the public good. Who's going to judge if it's being used correctly? Well, first of all, I think if it came down to a case of the executive versus the legislator, Locke would probably side with the legislator. That's another reason he calls legislator supreme power. So back in Locke's day, this would have been known as the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary supremacy. And the idea is, in cases of conflict, Parliament should preside. That was the basic gist behind executing a king, for example. If Parliament were not supreme, how could it judge the king? How could it execute the king? And so forth. Okay. But Locke would say, if you've got a government where, let's say, king and Parliament are both acting tyrannically, who else but the people could decide that they were not acting on behalf of the public good? And what Locke is saying is actually pretty straightforward. If the social contract said that people will give up their proto-political rights, their rights to have natural freedom, natural equality, to judge and execute the law of nature for themselves, if they're giving up those rights to the government, on what condition does the government hold those powers? On what condition does the government hold political power? Well, the condition is the people believe that the power they have entrusted to the government is being legitimately exercised. So this is sometimes called a trustee theory of political power, because the people give up political power, they entrust it to somebody else, but sorry, the people are still, let's say, the boss. And when the people say, you're abusing the power we entrusted you with, that means the government has lost its legitimacy. So this case of prerogative power is not unique. Locke is saying that the people at large, the subjects, in fact, the subjects are the ones who judge whether political power has turned into tyrannical power, whether political power has become what Locke calls despotic power. That's the first thing I want to talk about in these lectures on chapters 15 through 18. What is the difference between political power and despotic power? Which is one of the primary things that any people has got to judge, especially when the situation is looking more and more like a crisis, especially when the situation is looking more and more dire. The second thing I want to talk to you all about is despotic power, and when Locke believes that despotic power can be legitimately exercised. And Locke's basic answer is, most of the time, it can't. However, he's got one exception. And the one exception is in the case of household slavery. And this is a very discomforting fact, I think, to many people, but it's right there in the second treatise. Is that Locke has a justification of slavery, and that this justification of slavery is basically grounded in conquest. So I'm clearly not saying this is right. I would hope most of us would agree that slavery has no justification at all, but I do think we need to squarely confront the fact that one of the most influential political theorists, at least for the United States, has got a justification of slavery baked right into it. Okay, let's take a look at political versus despotic power. take a civil society or a commonwealth. The thing we notice about this diagram is there's basically only two kinds of people. This is opposed to Plato, who thinks there were three kinds of people, three kinds of functions in the city. In Locke's civil society, you've got this distinction between public officials who wield political power and private subjects who are subject to political power. How can this arrangement be legitimated? Well, the basic idea, as I was just explaining, is full members give up their political power to public officials. Private subjects give up their political power to public officials. And the public officials exercise the political power only on this judgment of the private subjects that they are exercising the power within bounds in a limited way for the right reasons to protect life, liberties, estates, and properties. Okay, so that's Locke in a gist. And he says, that's the social contract. Now, who signs the social contract? Who signs the social contract? Because the skeptical objection is always, where did I sign that? I don't remember signing a social contract. I'm pretty sure I didn't. I'm pretty sure if, let's say, you're a birthright citizen in a country like the United States, I'm pretty sure I was just born. And then I happen to be subject to this government's power. Sounds a lot like Robert Filmer, doesn't it? I'm naturally under this government's power and so forth. I was just born this way. Okay, but that's, according to Locke, that's not sufficient. Locke says the only thing that makes you a full or a perfect member of a civil society is when you give your explicit consent. Another way of putting it is Locke says you need to expressly contract in to your civil society. And Locke, I think, would point to a variety of things that we would be familiar with as contemporary Americans or people in the contemporary world. He would say, if you take a naturalization oath, for example, you have expressly contracted in to the society. So let's just take a look at some of the language around this to make this more clear. So naturalization oath of allegiance to the United States of America. You take this oath if you were born in another country, for example, have another citizenship, and you would like to move to the United States and become a citizen of the United States and so forth. I hereby declare on an oath, a promise, a contract, that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I hitherto have been a subject or a citizen, and that I support and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Okay, so you can see what's going on here. Locke is saying such oaths are actually kind of contractual arrangements. And you can also think of oaths to the military along exactly the same lines. What you're really consenting to is to be part of a military force whose primary job is to defend the civil society, to defend the Constitution, and so forth. Locke also thinks, and this is where the birthright citizenship and so forth would start kicking in, that there are partial members of a commonwealth. And Locke is going to say, yes, I realize these partial members didn't expressly consent to this government. It's more like they tacitly consented. They didn't outright say it, but in their behavior, we can see that they've actually accepted their membership, their partial membership in the civil society. They've actually accepted that there is a legitimate government here that rules this territory and so forth. Okay, and Locke is saying that these members are just as obligated to follow the law as the full members. They are just as obligated to follow the law as the full members. The only real difference is they have not made this explicit oath or made this explicit promise. So who's a partial member? Now, if you look on page 67 of the Prometheus edition, it's paragraph 119. Locke says, Every man that hath any possession or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth hereby give his tacit consent. So if you have, for example, property in a country, in a foreign country, and you go to that property, let's say for your summer vacation, Locke would ask, on what condition do you enjoy, that's his language here, enjoy that property? Well, the only reason that people can't just swoop in and steal your land while you're not around is there's a government there which is protecting that property. So when you go and you stay on that land, you are tacitly consenting to obey that other government. In other words, to follow the laws of that land. Okay. Locke wants to take it even farther, though. He says, whether this enjoyment be possession of land to him and his heirs forever, or lodging only for a week, or whether it be barely traveling freely on the highway. In that case, the individual is still obliged to obedience of the laws of that government. So it doesn't matter. You don't even have to own that land. You could just be going on vacation for a day. Or Locke would say, even if you're just walking down the path of a road, some path through the woods that the government cleared and is now securing from brigands and thieves, you're still tacitly consenting to not break the laws of that country. Okay. Here's the third scenario. So in the first two scenarios, political power is being exercised over the subject, and it's all grounded in tacit consent. The reason why it's legitimate is there's tacit consent. Now we've got two situations, and they're both using despotic power, and neither of them are grounded in consent. Okay, the first is the public officials start exercising despotic power, thereby leaving the civil society, thereby breaking the social contract, thereby using power they don't have any right to use. And despotic power, once again, is just arbitrary power and unlimited power used to take away people's lives, take away their liberties, to take away their estates, and to take away their possessions. So arbitrary, unlimited power that is that violates people's property. Okay, so that's despotic power. And when the government does that, they're no longer within the bounds of civil society. They've left the civil society and are now using, say, a police force and an army to tyrannize the subjects. Nobody has signed up for that. And in fact, Locke would say nobody could sign up for it because that's not a rational deal. You remember, the whole bit about Locke is you trade freedom to get more security. Why would you trade freedom to get less security? That is irrational, and anyone who claims they've signed up for a tyranny either doesn't understand what a tyranny is or is plainly acting against their rational self-interest. That's what Locke would say. But then there's another case. So, sorry, the red arrow represents Locke saying that a government tyrannizing over private subjects is illegitimate. There's no contractual arrangement that could legitimate it. However, there's another case of non-contractual arrangement and usage of despotic power that Locke does think can be legitimate. And that's why there's an arrow blue here. And it's basically the case of slavery. And Locke is thinking here of household slavery, and Locke would have had in his mind things like plantation slavery in the Americas or the Caribbean, or what the British people were calling West Indies. Okay. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that case, let's talk about what Locke thinks despotism is in general. Despotism is distinguished from both political and paternal power, and all three powers can be defined in terms of property. This is why that chapter 5 on property was extremely important. Because what Locke is saying is paternal power is the power that parents have over children who are incapable of managing their property. Locke is saying political power is power that a government exercises over subjects to better protect the property of the subjects. And what Locke is also saying is that despotic power is the power that a despot or a tyrant exercises over enslaved people who have no property, who are treated as property rather than as property owners. And what is going on here? You can see here that Locke defines individuals as the self-owning type. And you can see here that Locke defines social relations, be it parents over children, public officials over subjects, despots over enslaved people. You can see Locke defines social relations in terms of property relations. So you can see here, Locke thinks that you're either self-owning, and that's your kind of fundamental identity. That is the fundamental way that you relate to yourself, the fundamental way that you relate to your liberties, your life, your estates, your possession. These are mine. This is a kind of individualism of possession, you could say. And you can also see that this conception opens up for the possibility of owning others and of saying they are no longer self-owning. Somehow they have forfeited their right to self-ownership. Somehow they have been legitimately owned or enslaved by other people. And this kind of despotism is something Locke is actually going to try and defend. Now, in Locke's defense, I want to be clear, you can turn this self-owning argument in a variety of ways. It doesn't always lead directly to this legitimation of slavery. You could also think, for example, of arguments that you are the owner of your body, that your body is a kind of property, and therefore people cannot use or enjoy your body without your consent. In other words, you can use the same Lockean apparatus, this kind of Locke political theory, to defend the notion that if anyone has sexual relations with your person without your consent, it's sexual assault or rape, and that you have the right to defend yourself, possibly up to the point of killing them. Okay, so let's acknowledge that Locke is also saying some things that may seem much more palatable and much more appealing than this idea that people can somehow become other people's property. Now, let's also be very clear about what Locke is saying, because he says it. Locke claims that in a state of nature where the state of war has been initiated, there is one party who's in the right and there's one party who's in the wrong. There is the aggressor and the aggressed against. So the person who breaks the law of nature and who tries to basically take or appropriate another person's property, somebody who's going to violate another person's property right. And then there's the person who's trying to say, you're breaking the law, stop it. I'll execute the law of nature on you if you don't back off. We remember that Locke claimed that you can kill a thief. You can basically execute the death penalty. You yourself can execute the death penalty upon a thief in the state of nature who tries to take your money or who tries to take any of your possessions, really. And you remember the argument is who knows how far they would go. Now Locke says, if you would like to spare that person's life, because remember, you had the right to take their life. They have forfeited their right to self-ownership. You can instead do whatever you like with this person. Why? Because you could already do the worst possible thing to them. You could have killed them. Now Locke says you could certainly try and force them to do other things for you. And what Locke is really saying is you could enslave rather than kill that assailant. Okay, and that's chapter 4. That's what Locke says in chapter 4 on slavery. The objection, I think, should immediately arise, well, isn't that a contradiction of your claim that all people are born free and equal? Locke's immediate rejoinder would be, well, not if you believe in natural punishment. So Locke would say, if you actually accept my argument that you can execute an assailant who was initiated a state of war with you, then you should be able to accept that you can enslave them because they've basically forfeited their rights to property and they are open for appropriation. I think that's how Locke would put it. I think this is where many contemporary people all around the world would say that's a pretty big leap, Locke. That's a pretty big leap. How did you get from you can kill them to you can enslave them? We can talk about that. Another important thing to say is that Locke's theory of slavery could not justify racial slavery. You notice in this entire scenario where basically one person has conquered another justly, conquered another person according to the law of nature. This is a non-contractual arrangement. In this scenario, you had to do something wrong in order to forfeit your right to self-ownership. In other words, you had to try and assault somebody. You had to use force without right. A situation that Locke would have been very familiar with, where in British American colonization of the Americas, there were ideas emerging about slavery should be a hereditary condition, racially defined, where the people of African descent would inherit the condition of slavery matrilineally, that is, through the mother's line. That whole arrangement has got nothing to do with Locke's justification of slavery, because, once again, it's the theory of natural subjection, actually. It's a theory through this newfangled invention about race, and there being natural subject races and natural master races, that you are simply by the fact of being born into the condition of slavery where you shall stay for the rest of your life. So Locke does not have a racialized notion of slavery. There's no stuff here about, and that's why the white race shall rule all the subject races and so forth. That's not in that chapter, and that's not anywhere in the book. So by Locke's own theory of despotic power, what was going on in the British colonies in the Americas was not justifiable. That was not justified. Now, here's where principle and practice don't always coincide. Locke was not an abolitionist. Okay, sorry, that lack of surprise of the century, not surprise of the century. He's not an abolitionist. He's trying to justify slavery. So he's not against slavery per se. And in fact, it goes farther than that. Locke invested in the Royal African Country. This is a British corporation that was involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So he made money off slavery. And he went even farther than that. He co-wrote with his boss, basically, a guy named Lord Shaftesbury. He co-wrote a pro-slavery constitution for the Carolina colonies. Okay, so I don't know how he would have squared away what's written in the second treatise and with what he was actually doing in his life. You could just say that the principles and the practices did not seem to cleanly align. And this is where I think a guy like Locke is somewhat, well, actually, probably just an outright contradiction to somebody like Socrates. Because the whole point of Socrates is, look, the reason you learn about justice, the reason you know about justice, is so you can put justice into effect in your real life, that you can live a just life. That philosophy is not just knowing certain truths about reality, it's actually putting the truths into practice. And so the point of living life is to attain justice and to make sure your life is governed by this principle of justice. Locke, if this biographical information that I presented is fairly presented, Locke did not seem to, let's say, practice what he preached. Certainly not to the degree of being willing to die for what he believed was true. As we can see here, Locke is a philosopher of a different type. So for him, maybe he would say something like, well, there's practice. And practice doesn't always match up with principles. And sometimes, in order to profit, principles will have to go by the wayside. It wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the first time in world history that somebody was, principles and practice were out of line with each other. Just look up Thomas Jefferson's positions on slavery. He always admitted slavery was wrong, and he owned slaves his entire life. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence.